Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I can see that you are joining one by one. Thank you so much. It's a great day here for us. My name is Ana Clara Ciccolini, and I'm part of the King's Alumni Relations team. The Alumni Office works to engage and partner with our global community of alumni. We offer you a range of benefits, events online like this one, in person as well, and in your local communities, as well as opportunities to volunteer your time. If you would like to get in touch, you can see our details on our screen. Every academic year, we live stream this webinar series exclusively for you, our alumni, featuring our King's experts to offer you the chance to hear directly from our researchers and practitioners on some of the most important issues of our time. Today, our experts will explore the evolving concept of leadership and what King's is doing to reshape existing narratives in response to the global challenges of today's world. In the first part of this webinar, we will hear from our stellar panel. Before opening the floor for your questions, please do submit any questions via the Q&A function. We will also be live streaming and recording this event on our YouTube channel to audiences around the world. So whether you're watching this live or watching the recording, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. Without further delay, I'm delighted to hand over to our chair for this evening, Rachel Stockey, Head of Entrepreneurial Skills at King's Entrepreneurship Institute. She will introduce herself and our panelists and starts tonight's third King Expert Series of this academic year. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Anna. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you this evening. It's great to see so many of you joining us. I'm really excited for tonight's conversation and really invite you, as Anna said, to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A box so that we can ask our panelists some of your questions a little bit later on. As Anna mentioned, my name is Rachel Stockey. I'm Head of Entrepreneurial Skills at the King's Entrepreneurship Institute. We are King's hub for all entrepreneurial activity, including helping our staff, students and alumni to start their businesses. If you have an idea, please do get in touch. You're still welcome as alumni to come and join our community. And also, if you're interested in developing your entrepreneurial skills and mindset, we have a range of programs that alumni can get involved in. So I'm really happy to be here this evening. And I'm even more happy to welcome our three awesome panelists for this evening. So we have Professor Rosie Campbell, who is a professor of politics and the former director of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership. We have Dr. Michael Flavin, who is a reader in Global Education at African Leadership Center and the director of the President's Global Leadership Award Program. And we also have Dr. Arani Manoharan, who is the Senior Associate Director of Careers and Employability. So what we're going to do, as Anna mentioned, I'm going to hand over to each of our panelists in turn to give them the floor for a few minutes to tell you a little bit about themselves, their background, their connection to the topic of global leadership and what they really think is the key aspects of that, drawing on their own experience and knowledge. And then we've got a few questions to have a conversation with our panelists about that we've highlighted in connection to this conversation. And then I will draw out questions that have come through the chat from you of the questions that you would like to put to the panelists. So Rosie, would you like to kick us off with your introduction?
Of course, lovely. Nice to be here this evening. For 6 years until this January, I was the director of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership here at King's, and I've been the new director is Hee-Jung Chung, who's an amazing woman who's written fantastic work about the flexibility paradox in the workplace. And the chair remains Julia Gillard, who's the former Prime Minister of Australia and the only woman to hold that office. And the Institute was set up because when Julia finished her time in office, some of you may be aware, she had quite a difficult time in the press and received quite a lot of misogyny. And she reflected on to what extent was that because she was a woman, just the nature of politics, the way she came into office. And when she wrote her memoir, she realized there was a lot more research about the barriers to women's leadership and the stereotypes they face when they get there than she realized. which is often hidden behind academic paywalls, but there are also gaps in that research. So that's what the Institute is designed to fill, and to be an interdisciplinary place where scholars can work together to try and bring our knowledge together and work with practitioners and stakeholders who are bringing about change in the real world. So I'm a political scientist, and the new director, Heejung, is in the business school, and that shows how we think about leadership across the piece. My own research, I have a European Research Council large grant with my colleague, Professor Sarah Childs at the University of Edinburgh, and we're looking at the quality of democracy. We're using a case study of 5 European countries, but what we're trying to do is take the idea of liberal representative democracy seriously. So an illiberal democracy is one where the majority can have tyranny over everyone, whereas a liberal democracy, minorities are supposed to be protected. And so what we're trying to do in this very difficult time is to see actually how are the most marginalized communities in our 5-country case studies, and women in those communities, engaging with the political process and being represented. So obviously the question of political leadership and how that manifests itself is central to that project.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm sure a lot of that we will pull out in our conversation as we go through. Michael, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you. My name's Michael Flavin, and yeah, it's great to be here. My teaching and research interest in leadership goes back about 10 years when King's made the decision to develop learning opportunities on the subject of global leadership. Now, there was very little happening globally in this space at the time. That's all changed over the last 10 years, and most of the world's top universities now offer learning opportunities in this space, but we were very early adopters. And we made some key decisions early on. One was to make it interdisciplinary. So right from the beginning, we recruited students from all 9 faculties at King's, and that created an incredibly dynamic environment whereby students exchange key texts, methodologies of their disciplines, key findings. And in group work, it led to really fluid and dynamic and interesting and innovative environments. We've developed the program over the last 10 years, and we've reached the stage now that together with one of King's vice presidents, Professor Funmi Olonishakin, I've written what we think is the first book on teaching global leadership in higher education, which came out in last month. So we're hoping by those means we can start to contribute to a global dialogue across the academy on how we can accelerate and embed this field and use it in ways that actually are applied. So yes, we do cover learning theory, and we illustrate theory by looking at case studies, but we also do scenario-based learning, where we take that bedrock of knowledge and understanding and then see how would we use that to inform real-time, moment-to-moment decision-making in leadership contexts. We also recognize that followership is active, just as leadership is, that these states are constantly in a kind of fluid relationship of exchange. So it's a really interesting time on what is still a young subject in the academy. And my own research, as well as the book, I've got a research interest in leadership theory in relation to the Troubles in Northern Ireland, with a particular focus on Republican communities. And I've got a nice little side hustle as a published novelist and award-winning short story writer. So all in all, I stay quite busy. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And last but definitely not least, Arani, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Arani Manoharan, and yes, I'm a Senior Associate Director for Careers and Employability at King's, really leading up the Careers and Employability provision for our huge student and graduate community. And my own kind of leadership within this space is really around kind of inclusive curriculum design strategies that really are there to support students to develop the knowledge, the skills and experiences they need to be able to be successful in their lives beyond university. And I work with universities across the country in this space. But actually outside of my role at King's, I'm also a coach and consultant working in the space of leadership development and inclusive practice in higher education, with a real specialism in supporting academic and professional services staff from ethnic minority heritages, as well as female leaders to kind of move into more senior and executive leadership roles. So this is something I do both in the UK, but also internationally as well. I guess as an extra add-on is my actual academic research actually is in ethnic conflict. So there's a little bit of a connection between the three of us. So my academic research is in ethnic conflict experienced in post-colonial states, so where former colonies, and really that's also a piece around, as both colleagues have talked about in a way, where leadership and the role of leaders plays an important role. And I know perhaps there'll be questions around kind of the state of kind of world leadership and what that means for us moving forward. But that's it from me.
Amazing. As you can see, we have very interesting panelists. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I wonder, Arnie, if we start with you with our first question, which is, what do you think are going to be the key components of great leadership in the 21st century? Big question, just to kick us off.
I know. I think for me, just a general defining aspect of great leadership is really around inspiring people around a common vision. I think that's like a core foundational aspect of great leadership. And I think that is especially important in what we can kind of define as a VUCA 21st century, right? Like a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous 21st century, where we really need leaders to be able to bring people together, to recognize collective issues that we're all facing, both locally and globally. So for me, that is a defining component. How do you inspire the collective, right? Where, especially in an environment where we see increasingly those kind of polarized perspectives, how can you inspire the collective with a collective vision while celebrating kind of the difference underneath that? So maybe I'll start off the conversation saying that.
Amazing. Rosie, would you like to add your thoughts? What do you think the key components of great leadership are going to be?
I suppose it depends what we mean by great here. Do we mean kind of Alexander the Great? Do we mean, do we mean someone who is, very, very famous and has that kind of profile? And I think you've sort of hinted at that we're in this quite polarized space. And I think we've got a lot of complex problems facing the globe. And there can be a default with when people are frightened, we look for simple solutions. And I think leaders who can perform a kind of strongman leadership and say that if they just cut through the noise that they will make things all right, can be very persuasive. And I think that's a very difficult environment for genuinely great leaders to operate in, because when you're dealing with complex problems, how do you convey that in a way that is accessible and inspiring? And I think it's a real challenge, because I think a lot of the truly great leaders around the world you may not have heard of, because they won't necessarily be focusing on self-promotion. They'll be focusing on delivering and supporting those underneath them. But I do think we really do need some inspirational, authentic leaders who listen, show humility, and are able to cut through. But I don't envy them the task. And I suppose what I'd say to our alumni community is that we need you, because I think we really need individuals who are not just motivated by their own personal reward or status, but really want to follow the King's values of making the world a better place. And I think the way you do that as a great leader is you listen and you connect and you put others before yourself. And I don't think we're seeing enough of that in the globe. Julia Gillard, my former boss, is an example of someone who does behave that way, but we need more leaders like that. So if anything, I hope this conversation today will make many of you think that you might step forward and be these great leaders of the futures that we so desperately need.
Absolutely, a great call to arms. King's is hopefully a place of growing some great leaders. So it's great to see so many of the community here. But Michael, what's your thoughts on this opening question?
Well, if I can first follow up on a point made just now by Rosie, we do have this recurrence at the moment, a plethora of what we might call strongman leaders. Now, if we look at the study of leadership, that's going right back to the middle of the 19th century in the UK and the work of Thomas Carlyle. And it's hard not to be concerned by the historically regressive nature of leadership at this stage in the 21st century. And I think there should be alarm bells ringing there somewhere about there are other ways of doing this than going back into a nostalgically imagined past that was probably never there in the first place. More broadly, I think we need to consider what our unit of analysis is in global leadership, because historically that's been the nation state. But if we look at the genuine problems that are confronting us in the 21st century, they're not containable within nation states. We have the climate crisis. It doesn't recognize boundaries between countries. One of the byproducts of the climate crisis is more forced migration. Now, it's not the sole cause of forced migration, but it is a cause of forced migration. And we see around us what a politically incendiary issue that has become in recent years. And if we've got the starkest leadership lesson of the 21st century so far, a virus doesn't ask for a visa. So I think we're going to have to construct ways of engaging with these problems that transcend the nation state, and that's quite a paradigm shift. We definitely haven't made it yet, because if anything, there seems to be an increasing movement towards isolationism, which I think is guaranteed to fail, because it's not custom built to deal with and think beyond the nation state and how we can use truly global leadership to address complex problems which are themselves truly global.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've started to get a few questions come in for later, but I think there's a thread in here that has already sort of been picked up on that lends itself into our next question, which is, we have all seen the increasing trend towards polarizing styles of leadership, particularly in political leaders around the world at the moment. And Rosie, I wonder if we can come to you first to think about, what do you think will be the consequences of these polarizing leadership styles? And as a group of aspiring leaders and current leaders in organizations and in groups of people, how should aspiring leaders respond to that trend?
I mean, personally, I'm absolutely terrified. I feel that the lessons that we learned globally after the Second World War about collaboration and about leading together, as Michael said, about working across national borders, are being unlearned. And I think as a political scientist, there are some very basic things that we have sort of forgotten to talk about, about how access to information is such a key part of a functioning, healthy democracy, marketplace, society. And we have a world where traditional news media sources are trusted much less than before, and where people decide very often on their own facts. And that is a very difficult basis for effective leadership, because the temptation is to say, well, I'm going to pick my own facts and I will navigate that way. And I think there are some hard moments when the truth out. Michael talked about a virus doesn't discern which news media source you read. But I think that the really brave leaders will recognize that there are a few things we really desperately need to do. We need to regulate social media so that actually, in the same way as other kind of news media, complete falsehoods are not acceptable. And I think that we need to do much more in our education system at an earlier age for people to understand that what is good leadership, but what are also basic good human behavior of listening, engaging, deliberation, and that actually leadership is not an individual activity. There aren't individual great leaders. Leadership is a collective activity. It's the way we respect and listen to each other and come to joint decisions. And there are moments when you're at war, when a really hierarchical situation, when you need someone at the top to say, go, go, go. But actually to navigate complex problems, you need a wide range of inputs and expertise, and you need processes that allows them to come to fore, people's different experiences to be genuinely heard. And all of that requires some brave leaders to actually do some things that means they have to take on powerful organizations and individuals. I think we desperately need that to happen.
as a follow-up, I wonder, from your experience, particularly with the Global Institute of Women's Leadership, where does gender come into that?
It's such an interesting time because we hear things like Mark Zuckerberg saying we need more kind of, I can't remember, we said masculine or macho leadership styles. And actually, I mean, I'm a big believer that there are diversities of leadership styles. And actually, a healthy workplace is one where you can be an introverted leader, an extroverted leader, perhaps have classically what we might call feminine traits or masculine traits. But the point is that different perspectives are included. But there is definitely a flavor out there of a backlash against what's seen as a sort of feminization of leadership. It's terribly sad because that feminization, which I don't think are characteristics that are unique to women, but we think of as being female, is about empathy, listening, humility, and that's good leadership. So I think, just stamping your authority is not the way to navigate through complex problems. So it's pretty terrifying. At the same time, we see some women adopting that kind of populist strong man, strong woman politics. So there's no simple relationship between women leaders and feminine leadership, but we do tend to characterize some of those more empathetic traits as feminine. At the moment, they're being described as weak, which I think is a shame. We need both. That's how we make good decisions.
Amazing, thank you. Michael, I wonder what your thoughts on this are in terms of consequences of polarizing leadership, and particularly picking up on your point around, some of the problems that we're dealing with don't acknowledge country borders or continent borders. We need global leadership to deal with them. But what's your thoughts on the consequences of this polarizing leadership style, and what should leaders be thinking about in order to be able to address that across the world?
Yeah, I mean, picking up on that and also picking up on what Rosie's just said, absolutely, leadership is collaborative. You can't do it on your own. Any of us could get dropped on a desert island by ourselves and confidently state, I am the leader. It's an utterly meaningless statement unless other people are there. So leadership is necessarily collaborative, and yet we still tend to frame discussion in terms of leaders that prioritize individuals. I mean, we got this running undercurrent of a kind of case study of the pandemic. But I think that was quite a really interesting lens through which to look at leadership, because if you think of what happened in New Zealand under the leadership of Jacinda Ardern there, it was explicitly empathetic. And the strategy was led by the science, which led to really low fatality rates in New Zealand. Now, you're looking at a remote island nation that's economically in the upper stratum, so it has some natural advantages. But yet, at the same time, you had to look at a strategy in which the leader didn't try to impose themselves, but took what in leadership theory we'd call the adaptive leadership approach of stepping back and let the experts in the space create the solutions, which led to really good outcomes. Now, we can contrast that with other leaders who put themselves forward as experts despite the experts, and frankly came up with some pretty idiosyncratic approaches to how you could contradict the virus. I'm not proposing to name names, but I can if it is the will of the discussion to do so. But I think and how this ties in with gender, I think, is quite important, because there's often been this perception, and Rosie called it characterization, that's an entirely opposite term, that the women leaders are kind of in this double bind, that a lot of traditional leadership virtues historically are associated with masculine modes of behavior. Yet this more caring, nurturing side actually got into the foreground a bit more during the pandemic. If you think back to your childhood, who was it who was constantly nagging you to wash your hands? It was your mom. It was suddenly these kind of, so it did actually create a space to legitimize more stereotypically feminine case study, because it came up as this crisis that there wasn't a rule book for how to do this. So we see this range of leadership styles practiced within nations and across nations, and I think it should continue to be a really important learning resource for us, because I think other crises of that magnitude are probably heading our way.
Yes, and we will come on to talk about a few of those. But Arnie, I wonder what your thoughts are on this in terms of consequences of polarizing leadership styles, but particularly from your role within the careers and employability for people that are thinking about how they enter this workforce, who are going to be working for leaders, probably at the beginning of their career, but hopefully will aspire to move into leadership roles over time. What do you think they should be thinking about?
Well, I think it's interesting that you framed it that way, and I was really going to talk about, actually, we're talking about the macro, this really like a world scale level, and you can actually look at it in the micro, right, within our organizations as well, and how this plays out, the concept of polarization, which very much does as well in our organizational context. But I think it's really important to recognize leadership at different levels. So leadership is not just someone with authority and a title that is senior, but leadership exists at all levels of an organization. And that's why the concept of like a leadership ecosystem, where actually we kind of democratize leadership a little bit more, and kind of create this kind of collective vision and messaging is really, really important in an environment where polarization can kind of come to the fore, basically. So I think that is a really important piece. And if it's okay, there's actually a question in the chat that was actually around, should we be encouraging students to focus on leadership when they have to develop more foundational competencies? And I think that this is where that concept of not thinking about leadership as being the top person in an organization, but actually cultivating leadership qualities. And Rosie was talking about empathy, emotional intelligence, thinking about those, what is leadership, breaking it down and encouraging students to cultivate those through everyday practice is a really important way for all aspiring leaders, not just our students, but those moving forward already in their careers to really be cultivating their leadership competency as well. So for aspiring leaders, that's what I would definitely say, which is really think about those underlying or framework of competencies that actually encompass what leadership is. And I very much agree with Rosie that it is around empathy, it is around emotional intelligence, about authenticity. Don't try and be someone else, be yourself in this process, and people will recognize that. And the concept of followership, they will follow you much further if they believe in that you believe what you're saying, basically. And I think just those genuine traits will allow you then to overcome what can be quite performative kind of practices, in that when people are competing by using polarizing kind of themes to move forward.
On that point, I just wondered, for some, well, you talk about emotional intelligence and empathy, they're quite big, holistic type terms. And I wonder if, on a really practical level, if someone's like, I want to develop into that kind of leader, how do I do that? What advice would you have for somebody who's thinking about, that's the type of leader I want to be? What's my next steps?
Well, maybe Rosie wants to go first, and I can follow up, Rosie, as this is like your prime area of research expertise as well.
It's not really my area of research expertise, but I do have thoughts on it. I mean, I think, one thing, there's a lot of research saying reading novels helps with empathy. Putting yourself into I know we've got a novelist in the panel. Putting yourself into other people's shoes is a really important start. And I think when you're developing your leadership skill as an individual and you're in your workplace, actually just trying to put yourself in the shoes of your colleagues and thinking about how do they feel, and asking, I think really engaging with how people feel about their jobs. I mean, as a manager, one of the first things that I always do when I meet a new team member is try and understand what their 5-10 year future aspirations are, because that gives me a space to think actually as a leader, and you can do, how do I support them? And I think you can think of that way when you're a part of a team. You think about the team members and actually your overall goal, but also the individuals within that, and how do you build connections and relationships? And I think that's a really good place to start. Shall I hand back to you, Ronini?
Yeah. So for me, I very much agree, and I think those are very practical steps that people can take. I think people think the roles of managers and leaders are more task oriented than they are. That phrase of culture eats strategy for breakfast is true, because actually it's a people oriented activity, management and leadership. And so cultivating your people capabilities is really, really important. So active listening is a key part of empathy, and emotional intelligence. Ultimately, understanding your colleagues and your team is really important if you do want your strategy to move forward and be implemented and successful. So so many leaders and managers are very task oriented. They want to achieve the KPIs, which is important. But the reality is that your staff you're not doing it. Your staff are the ones that are making it a reality. And therefore, it's really important then actually to cultivate your people skills to be able to bring them on board. Rosie talked about humility, like a leader that has humility, who is, who isn't always trying to be perfect, but just doing their best and showcasing that, articulating that. There's so much more goodwill if a mistake is made amongst then your kind of colleagues and staff community, because they recognize you're trying your best, that you are actually with them, kind of behind them, kind of pushing them forward. So I think these are the types of things you can think about when thinking about what does empathy and emotional intelligence mean in this space of leadership.
Amazing, thank you. I think we've lost Michael momentarily. Hopefully he's finding his way back to us, so we will catch him up if he's able to rejoin. But we had this thread that we've picked up on through a couple of our questions so far, acknowledging that we have some big macro global challenges that we are already dealing with, but are very much heading our way as well in their intensity, be that climate change, be that the impact of AI and automation and the changes that we know that that's having in across the world, but also from a perspective of generational attitudes and priorities changing in the way that people entering the workforce view work and the balance and the things that they want out of their work life, to name just a few of the challenges that are causing these big different trends. And I wonder how you both feel leaders should be thinking about their role in navigating some of these changes and in also helping their teams and their organizations navigate that change. Like, what is the role of the leader when you're facing such levels of uncertainty and change? And I know that the word unprecedented is sort of got a asterisk against it now, but it's hard to find a replacement for that word. But Rosie, I wonder if you kick us off. We're going for the big questions, but I wonder what your thoughts are when we say that.
I've already said that I do think that we need some leaders who put the wider good, public benefit before their own progression. And I think we need real braveness. I'm thinking about the general in the US who's had his protection taken away from him for doing what he thought was the right expert advice. And I think, all of our alumni have expertise and you'll become experts in your field. And a really important aspect of leadership is going to be brave, is about holding on to what you know to be right. If you've got the evidence in front of you, you need to be prepared to stand up. And the thing is, then others, as Arini says, will follow you. If they see you're prepared to take a risk with your own personal progression or job security or whatever it is to do the right thing, others will follow you. And I'm afraid that the corrupt leaders, strongmen leaders, often lead through fear. And one of the things that they do is that they go very, very hard after anyone who dissents to try and shut everybody else up. And so this is a moment where being one of those brave people that will stand up is incredibly important, because we need to see leaders who are prepared to do that. I wish we were seeing more leaders in the tech sector, for example, saying, actually, what we really need to do is take some of this harmful content down. We need leaders who are prepared to do the right thing, because, at the end of the day, one of the things I feel at my stage of career is, as you get older, you start to take a lot of pleasure from bringing on colleagues underneath you. And that becomes, I think, if you're a more transformative or adaptive leader, that becomes a really important part of the job. And you start to think about your legacy. And I don't think that should be about, whether there's a building with your name on it. It's about, actually, when I'm lying on my deathbed, did I do something that was worthwhile? Was I part of something that was worthwhile? And I think that's what leadership is. And I think we think too much about the CEO with lots of money and the private jet. But a real leader is somebody who actually has a vision that is shared, that is created through listening and engagement with others, and is prepared to be brave to support that wider good.
Thank you. Welcome back, Michael. Just to catch you up where we're at, we're talking about the fact that we have some huge macro changes coming our way through, whether that be climate change, whether that be changes in tech, we would talk about AI and automation, or whether that's shifting attitudes in generations coming through the workforce. So I'll give you a minute to think about what you would like to add to the discussion. But Arnie, if we come to you, what's your take on this? What do leaders need to be thinking about when we have all these huge challenges in our landscape?
I think obviously Rosie at the start said, you know, what is great leadership actually? What do we mean by great in that context? And we are talking a lot about people in the public eye who are not showcasing perhaps what we would identify as being great leadership. And she also said, you know, those who do great leadership are likely behind the scenes, unseen kind of people. And I think, you know, there's a question in the chat that says, you know, of course we want great leaders to have character and integrity, but what do we do in our day-to-day? That's exactly right. Live with that character and integrity, like understand what your values are as a leader and practice those on a daily basis, role model those, encourage your environment, those in your community, to also recognize the values and to live those on a day-to-day basis. And it's why the concept of culture within an organization is so important, because that's what it is. And it's why investing time in establishing a really strong culture is really, really important. I think we can get really lost when we think about these macro issues that we just don't have control over, direct control over. It can feel incredibly overwhelming, depressing, Rosie said terrifying, like what's going to be happening. But we'll get lost if we think about it from that perspective. Whereas if we think about within our frames of influence, what can we do as leaders is actually live and role model those that integrity and character and values that we have, and really just try and encourage others to recognize it and live it as well. So for me, that's what I always bring it down to, because I can spiral. When I'm doing my research on ethnic conflict, it's so easy to spiral because the issue is vast. It's a wicked problem, and there's so many wicked problems within our global macro environment. But I think it's important to bring it back to actually within our frames of influence, what can we do to kind of push forth a really positive way forward?
I wondered, there was just another chat that kind of connected into what you were saying, and I wondered what your thoughts are. They've just put top tips to pursue a leadership presence in a room full of loud voices. What would you say to that?
So, you know, I am a woman of color in a Russell Group institution, one of the top universities in the country, and I do sometimes walk into the room and feel completely out of place in that space at King's, I've got to say, honestly speaking. And I am also an introvert, so I'm not naturally someone who goes in with like this high energy in that space. And I think the key thing is to be prepared so that you can be confident, because you have to sort of, the concept of fake it till you make it is something I live by, folks, because when you're not feeling that confidence, you've got to fake it till you get to that place of confidence. And I think how I do that personally is really just having all my receipts in order. That's a very Gen Z phrase there, having my receipts in place, but really going into that space fully prepared, ready to take on what can be very challenging questions coming towards you in not always the most empathetic manner. So for me, that's one tip that I will say in your organization. If you are facing a challenging environment where you have to make your voice heard, is just to go forth with that piece that you know what you're talking about, and actually it's really valuable that everyone hears it. So that's my one tip.
Amazing, thank you. Michael, I wondered what your thoughts are on this. To bring you back into a very big question, big changes. How do leaders think about and prepare their teams and their organizations with the level of big change that we're facing at the moment in the century?
Yeah, first, sorry for my absence. I had to find a pound coin for the electricity meter, so I'm glad to get that sorted. Thank you. I heard AI mentioned. I have to come in and declare I'm an AI skeptic. I think a lot of this comes down, I had a prior research interest in technology enhanced learning in higher education. And in my very early career, there was this thing called Second Life, a virtual world. And the hype at the time was, oh, that the university is finished. Everyone's going to be living through avatars, studying in virtual campuses. I mean, the whole thing, the air went out of it very quickly. And the universities that had bought virtual campus space there looked decidedly silly. A few years later, we saw the MOOC. And, no one was going to do a conventional degree anymore. Everyone would just be accumulating micro credits at universities worldwide. And again, it came and went. So when I hear all the hype about AI, I cannot help but get the feeling we have been here before. How it ties into leadership explicitly is this idea of the panacea, that a thing is going to happen. Rosie made the point that we're faced with complex problems, yet we have these leaders who purport very simplistic one-line solutions. I think Brexit exposed this. I mean, doubtless there were legitimate views on both sides of the argument, but take back control was this very simple statement in the face of a very complex problem. And I think it would have to be recognized in terms of all the complexity and difficulty that's come from that decision, that it really wasn't as simplistic as it seemed in the first place. So in terms of what we do, I think recognize that with complex problems, they don't avail themselves of simplistic solutions. So if we're going to address the problems we're faced with, it really helps to understand them first. I'm quite happy to sign up with the introverts, by the way, and throw my lot in there. And would recommend, there's so many books on leadership of very variable quality, but Susan Cain's Quiet, which is a kind of homage to the introverted leader, is a really interesting text to work from. She's also achieved that extraordinarily rare accomplishment of having an interesting TED Talk. So she's worth it for that too. So yes, that's my view.
Sure, I wondered if I could leap in. Oh, yes, sorry, I just wanted to leap in drawing these 2 points together, because I think this idea of the introverted leaders and how do you cope when you arrive in this space where there are lots of very loud people, and it goes back to the leadership being a collective exercise, is we need to find allies. Because if you're being spoken over in a room or your voice is being discounted, trying to fight your way in is much harder than somebody saying, excuse me, we've not heard from X yet. And actually the person who doesn't, I think we've all been in meetings where there's someone that goes on and on and on, and anything new that they had to say was a long time ago. And then there are people when they say something, it's going to be a useful intervention. They're the people you want in the meeting. But I think we do have to work together to make sure that the droning stops and that useful intervention is given space.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I wondered, we've talked quite a lot about the challenges of leadership, right? And we've addressed that we're in some challenging political times. We've got some big challenges we need to deal with, and we need great leaders to step forward into that space with authenticity, with empathy. There's a great, I wondered whether we could inject a little optimism into the discussion, because there's a question in the chat asking if you guys have any examples of people that you've seen or someone that you've worked with who you would hold up as a great leader, and what it is about them that you think, yeah, that's the sort of leader that we need more of. I wonder if anyone has someone that comes to mind immediately.
That's so easy for me, because working with Julia Gillard for 6 years was such a dream. It was someone who was a former prime minister who sits in an open plan office in King's and has so much expertise and knowledge, never name drops, treats everybody she meets with the same respect and interest. And I think when leaders behave that way, that's how they're able to really understand what's happening in an organization, because people will not be afraid to bring problems to them. And they listen, they hear, they share their expertise without preaching, without dominating. Julia Gillard, if only she could be cloned.
More Julia Gillards in the world. That's what we need. Michael, how about you? Who comes to mind when you think great leader?
Interesting. I'm going to cheat slightly, because Rosie has the advantage of being on first name terms with Julia Gillard, which is pretty good. But when we were talking earlier about how leadership was framed in that post-World War II period, the UK is an interesting case study, because it had a very charismatic wartime leader in Winston Churchill. But then when the general election was held in 1945, he got absolutely trounced. And the leader of the Labour Party who became Prime Minister was Clement Attlee, who had nothing like Churchill's charisma or presence or skills with rhetoric, but had a strategy for economic and social reconstruction. I think if we look at a seemingly much more extroverted figure in that administration, Anorin Bevin, the creation of the National Health Service, I mean, we really shouldn't estimate what a Herculean task that would have been at any time whatsoever. But to do it at a time of, where the economy's on the floor, the population's decimated, and yet to create that. And as well as being health minister, he was simultaneously housing minister, because housing was seen as a question of public health. And the vision was to create council housing that was so good that people wouldn't want the alternative. So he had the idea of using local materials so that even things like the brick color would reflect the composition of the soil using artisan labor. But progress was frighteningly slow because of the extent to which that class had been decimated in the war anyway. And so that government only lasted till 1951. But we have seen, when we've worked in explicitly collaborative ways, as nations, as a species, we've got a great deal done. So if we can learn worthwhile lessons from history about what are the conditions in which we actually achieve extraordinary things and make remarkable progress, that learning is useful for how we can put forward a strong counter narrative now and try and build up support for that very different approach to leadership and followership.
Yeah, amazing. Arnie, what's your thoughts?
Well, someone in the questions have commented that they learn from bad leaders the best, and I got to say I'm that as well. When you just observe and see, I wouldn't do it like that, and then you do the opposite is how I learned best, I guess. If I think about the sector, as in the HE sector, there's the PVC for Education at London South Bank, who's Zainab Khan, and who, when you meet, is just such a regular person, who's just their whole her success is because she brings every person she meets on board with what she is doing through just being a regular human being. And I know that sounds funny to say, but I think we dramatize leadership as being this performative thing where you have to be something exceptional. And I think actually why she's so successful is because of how what's the phrase at this point in time this evening, like approachable she is, and how people believe in what she wants to be doing, and so she's been at a couple of different institutions now in that kind of level of role, relatively young, moving into that role as well, and has done so because strategy and culture have come together for her, and she utilizes really exceptional people skills to bring people forward with her as well in what is quite a challenging sector at the moment, with lots and lots of hurdles that we all have to jump through. So I'll say from a much smaller scale is that colleague.
Amazing. I'm I'm flicking backwards and forwards because I'm reading questions and picking out. So we're going to rattle around a few of the different questions that have come in through the chat, because people have picked up on lots of different threads through the conversation. So we might bounce around a little bit. And if you have other questions, please do put them in the Q&A. But I wondered, picking up particularly on us being in the 21st century, I think one of the questions really hits on something about the current time that we're living in, which is, we talked about making hard decisions as leaders for the greater good. How do leaders balance making tough decisions without encroaching on freedoms? And I think this is a very contemporary conversation, this idea of how you cannot encroach on my individual freedom, and what the role of the leader is in navigating that decision-making process. But let's come back the other way. Arnie, do you want to jump straight back into that one?
I studied human rights law, and we always talk about this, right? Which is like, I have these rights, but your rights shouldn't impinge on other people's rights, basically. So the concept of freedom is, yes, we have freedom, but our freedom shouldn't then impinge on others' freedoms. So that's a very simple way of talking about it. But for those who are really love to talk about the concept of freedom and rights and say that, us within a community, within a society, having restrictions means that our rights are being impinged, when actually what we're doing is ensuring that everybody is able to live in a free, fair environment. It's a different way of thinking about it. So freedom does not mean that you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, regardless of the consequences. It is actually that you can live life with integrity to achieve the things you want to within an environment that's safe and well. So I think that's how I would approach it. If someone came up to me and talked to me about it, that's how I would think about it. Yeah.
Right. Rosie, do you want to come in on that point?
There were a few questions in the chat that related to this. One was about the army and leadership, and one was about the question you've raised about tough decisions. And I think the point is that there's not just one model of leadership. We've said there are multiple leadership styles, and I think it's healthy to have both. I've just been doing a project for the Ministry of Defence looking at the Army officer recruitment pipeline. And one of the things that struck me is just how impressive so many of the individuals that I've met through that project are. And the Army officers, motto is something like the servant leadership, so it's all about service. And I think that's an incredibly important way to think about leadership as service. And I think it's really important to differentiate moments of crisis from everyday life. And, if you've got a state where you're in an organization or a country where you're in a perma crisis, that is highly dysfunctional. If you think about, an authoritarian regime where there's a manufactured perma crisis and therefore the leader is always exercising that kind of high level of control. There are moments, we talked about the Second World War, we've talked about COVID, where a leader may need to be extremely decisive, take expert advice, but there isn't time, and you need a hierarchy in order to make things happen. If that's the way you operate all the time, it's highly dysfunctional, because how does information about what's really happening on the ground permeate to the top? You cannot function like that for a long, long time without things going seriously wrong in an organization or a country. So it's about recognizing that there will be moments where you need to be extremely responsive. But as a leader, if you've already built relationships and a culture where people are not afraid to bring problems and work well collaboratively with a shared common vision, then you're in a very good position to respond effectively to a crisis, because people will understand, as you said, Arani, people will understand this is someone who tries their best and they're in a difficult, high pressure situation. They've got to make a decision. Now, if you make a mistake, they're going to be more understanding if that isn't your modus operandi all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, what's your thoughts?
Hearing the question made me think it was underpinned by quite a neoliberal worldview. That may not have been intentional, but I think that's partly how it came across. Now, look, neoliberalism is a legitimate philosophy. We look, its early stirrings in Central Europe post-war, applied very suddenly in Chile after a military coup there in the 1970s. And then we see with the election of the conservative government here in 1979, the Republican administration under Ronald Reagan in 1980, it's become quite a dominant way of looking at the world and a dominant mode of economic practice, spread to India in the 1990s, Australasia, pretty much everywhere. But I think how neoliberalism privileges the individual at the expense of society. One of my published articles from last year, co-authored, looked at the undergraduate prospectuses of UK universities, and it was I found it quite a kind of disturbing piece of research, because so many of these prospectuses, articulate life as this kind of rather precarious struggle for resources post-graduation. So you'd better get this degree out there. Perhaps more worrying still, if you look at the prospectuses of Russell Group universities, they tend to present a broader panoply of opportunities than post-92 universities were doing, which just, I think, underlines the extent to which HE has become stratified. So I think it's had a good run for its money. It's been there since the 1970s. And if we look at peer-reviewed scholarship, including the work of Thomas Piketty, what it has done in practice is concentrate more and more wealth, and thus more and more power, in fewer hands. Now, again, I worry, to what extent can we address constructively the problems with which we're confronted with an economic base that concentrates wealth, power, media in the hands of a small number of people? And I think, if that's your economic base, don't be surprised if your superstructure articulates the same values and priorities. So for me, I think, look, we need to do some urgent rethinking on an economic and political level. We've had a couple of generations of neoliberalism. A small subset of people have become extraordinarily rich, whilst the rest of us can no longer get secure jobs with pensions at the end of them. It's time for some imaginative thinking, I think, for a new politics.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. I think I'm conscious of time. We've got just over 5 minutes left, but I really wanted to pull out one of the other questions that was in the chat. Was we've talked a lot about big macro things that are happening in the world, but one of the questions is, how do these frameworks of leadership apply to smaller groups and communities of maybe even a dozen or less? And I wonder, for the last 5 minutes, whether we bring our conversation back into the really kind of everyday, the practical, the world that each of us are living in, and the organizations that majority of the people on the call will be operating in and living in and working in today, and what your thoughts are on how to think about leadership in our everyday positions as they and the world that we're living in currently. And maybe you're just like top tips for how we move forward from this conversation for people that are thinking, I want to be this kind of leader. I know I'm operating in a world that's complex, but I still have to live every day through it, and I want to do that well. Michael, maybe we start with you, but how do you pull from the things that we've been talking about from the macro level down to that, and what would you say is your kind of top tips, parting words of wisdom? What would you say to those watching?
Well, okay, for me, leadership and followership are not dualism. It's not a binary. For me, it's a continuum. And I would say to the question, everyone, just think about your own life, either your relationships with family, friends, intimate relationships, work relationships. You're at different points on that continuum in different areas of your life. So you're constantly moving between leadership and followership all the time. You're constantly practicing them. You're constantly seeing efficacy, what works. Now, in short term, shouting at a cat to get off the windowsill, if you've got a good aim with what you're throwing at it, it might have short-term efficacy. It's unlikely to initiate long-term changes in behavior, particularly if your cat's like mine. But I think we're constantly negotiating. It's a human practice. When people get together, there are variables. I think it was mentioned earlier about making connections with others. Well, if you're going to have successful strategies, that's exactly what you have to do. Find commonalities of interest. And so I think we're implicated in leadership and following by the very fact of being alive day to day. So the parting message is stay alive, please. And then just keep that learning going, because it is a continuum, not a binary. And we're constantly learning about leadership and followership if we allow ourselves to learn those lessons.
Very, very wise words. Rosie, why don't we come to you?
I think it's really important to think about yourself and be very self-reflective about what your strengths and weaknesses are. And then say you find yourself in a group, whether it's at work or in your personal life or in your community of, say, about 12. What is it that you bring? What is it that you contribute? And lead in that area, but make space for others to lead at the things they're really good at and support them. So I think as an extension of what Michael said is that this idea of the leader at the top is often not the case in a group of 12. It might well be that you are the person who's a real doer and you are driving things, but you need people who you can delegate to. But you might be the person who recognizes actually the skills of others and that you're going to support them. I was vice chair of my PTA, and I have a friend who is a massive doer, and she liked to talk strategy with me, and I like the fact that she was a doer. And I think it's important to think to yourself about what can I bring, and then reflect on that in your leadership style.
Amazing, thank you. Arnie.
And I think I'll flip that as well. So if you do happen to be the lead of your small group, is to recognize what value all of these other people bring to that team environment. And I think that's really important as the lead of that group, to recognize that and to utilize that, maximize that, celebrate that. I also think it's really important that you take that responsibility to work with everyone to set the course, like what is the goal and how are we going to move together towards that goal, what is the role that everyone plays in that space. And I personally also really, whilst I understand you have to be adaptive, I think my default is the service kind of leader kind of position, which is to ask the question, what can I do to help? So how can I help is a very simple thing that one can do in that kind of small scale environment as well. And I think if you're the lead of the group, I think people just so appreciate it when you just ask that very simple question. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. We've traversed a big, complex topic, and it's been really great to hear from all of you with your expertise and experience on the topic. So thank you so much. I hope it's a conversation that everyone's enjoyed. And I'm going to pass back to Anna, I believe, 1 minute to finish time.
Yes, well done, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was so interesting. I was just listening very carefully. And thank you so much for everyone who submitted amazing questions. And it gave us the chance to also explore different aspects. And I just want to say huge thank you to our chair, our panelist, for sharing their expertise and for joining us today for such an engaging discussion. It was amazing. We will appreciate your feedback as always. Please complete our quick survey. It will take you only 2 minutes. You can see the QR code on the screen right now. And if you scan it, or then you can also see it on the chat. We have shared the link to our form, and we will really, really appreciate your feedback to improving our events. And look out for our next King's Expert series that will be taking place in March 2025, and more details and registrations will be available soon in our website. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.